Hey guys, welcome to the video on Chapter 9, Lesson 1. I have three objectives for you guys for this lesson. First off, I want you guys to understand why cells have to divide in the first place. Secondly, I want you guys to understand the steps of what we call the cell cycle. And third, I want you guys to understand what's happening to the DNA before and during cell division. So, the first question really comes down to, guys, why do cells even have to divide in the first place? Or maybe a better question would be, why are there no Godzilla cells? I mean, if you think about it, it doesn't really make any sense. Why do we have giant cells rolling across the landscape? Why do these cells have to be contained in these bodies like cats and dogs and humans and plants? Shouldn't they just be able to be on their own without that? It's a question that scientists had to kind of tackle with, and hopefully for horror fans, the movie The Blob kind of maybe answered for you. And that's it. It's about the surface area to volume ratio. And you probably just gave me that face in your face again saying, Mr. Brad, that doesn't make any sense. What the heck is a surface area to volume ratio? Well, basically, here's what this statement says. It says, the smaller an object is, the higher surface area to volume ratio. So what that means is that when you are small, so if you have a cube that has a 1 centimeter cube, it has a surface of 6 centimeters square and a volume of 1 centimeter cubed. That gives it a ratio of 6 to 1. However, when you have a bigger cube, it's 2 centimeters cubed, then you have different numbers, 24 and 8, and that gives you a ratio of 3 to 1. Now, I've kind of answered the question about what happens as things get bigger because you've seen how the ratio begins to decrease, but your question might come down to, well, why does that matter? How come that's an issue? Well, I'm going to give you the example here. What it means is this. A larger surface area means a smaller surface area to volume ratio, which means there's basically more stuff inside the cell, which leads to harder to move things around and more energy is needed to move stuff. Let's look at the examples right here on the right. In these three different cell examples, you have one that's 1 micron. Micron is just a really small way of measuring things. One that's 2 and one that's 4. If you look at each one of these cubes right here, the one that's 4 microns is just gigantic compared to the one with only 1 micron, even though it only has a surface side of 4 times bigger than here. So what you've seen here is that the amount of volume inside this cell right here has just increased exponentially. It's increased very quickly. What that causes is that it's now a lot harder to move things around. So let's say I'm the nucleus right here, and I want to send things outside of the nucleus. Well, that means I am going to have to find a way to do that. Well, if I'm going to send something from the nucleus out here, it's a quick trip. I just clink, bang, and I'm done. I'm outside the cell, and I can send my product out. If I'm in this cell right here, okay, I'm only twice as big, but I have a lot more volume. So I want to send something out to the outside of the cell. Takes a lot longer for it to get there. Even though it's only twice as big, it takes a lot longer for it to get there. And now this cell, which is only twice as big as this cell, it has to travel an enormous distance to get from one place to the other. You can see how each line almost just increased in size. It goes drastically. And actually, if you graph this on a table, what you actually see is a curve that looks something like this. If you have your two axes, you have your y, and you have your x, you have something like this. And what that does is it makes it more expensive to move things around. It makes it a lot harder to get things from the nucleus and other important parts here to the outside of the cell. And as you're going to learn later on in biology, that it's always better to be efficient. You want to be as efficient with your energy as possible. You want to be as cheap as possible. You want to be as easy as possible because life does not like hard. And this right here is hard. And no one likes hard. So we'll put a big sad face right here for being hard. Actually, that's more angry. I need to make him more sad. There we go. That's still pretty bad. Okay, but yeah, you get the idea, hopefully. Okay, so cells have to divide. And cells divide because of the surface area to volume ratio. Now, this cycle of cell division is called the cell cycle. So when we're talking about cell division, we see this cell cycle taking place. Now, essentially, it comes in a series of steps. The first one is called the G1 phase. This is basically when the cell grows and performs all normal functions, as you see here. So your brain cells are stuck in the G1 phase because they're never dividing. They just kind of stick to themselves. They do their thing. They're brain cells. That's what they do. Now, in the S phase, the DNA is replicated, so you make double the amount of DNA you have. In the G phase, the cell actually begins to prepare to divide. And then there's the important part, which we're going to talk a lot about in this chapter, which is called mitosis and cytokinesis. Mitosis is just cell division. So when you see the word mitosis, we're just talking about making two cells. It's about cell division. It's making one cell and making two cells. In cytokinesis is just the idea of taking that cell and splitting it in half. And I'll go into more detail on that later. But for now, know that mitosis is cell division and cytokinesis is cells splitting apart. So this video focuses mostly on the parts that are not involved in mitosis. And there are basically three phases, and there's three steps you kind of have to remember. The first one is that there's a G, S, and G2 phase. And to see what those do, just look at this slide right here because it explains right here what they do. So just look back here if you have some idea. I need a reminder. Now, mitosis, like I said, this is just the part where the cell divides. And the steps to this will be covered in the next lesson, so don't worry about it too much. And cytokinesis, this is just when the cell splits in half, creating two new cells. And I'll again go into more details on that in the next lesson. So, the DNA in the cell. The DNA is stored inside what's called chromatin. It's basically like a goo-like substance. And the chromatin is just DNA and proteins and other molecules that basically help the DNA. So if you look inside the nucleus and you want to find the DNA inside of the nucleus, it's held in what's called chromatin. So the chromosome is a little bit more zooming in. So if the chromatin is like the big goo that holds everything, the chromosome is actually a structure that looks kind of like two little things coming together like this. These things right here are actually chromosomes. And these are the actual DNA. So these little yellow weird parts here are actually strands of DNA. And that's the structure that holds the DNA and other proteins. So if you're actually looking for individual DNA molecules, you'll find it right here inside of the chromosome. Now, what's the difference between chromatin and chromosomes? The difference is that the chromatin is like the goo of holding all the chromosomes, and the chromosomes are like the individual parts of the goo. Okay, so what happens to the DNA? Well, chromosomes make copies of themselves, and that happens during the S phase of interphase, which is talking about those steps I showed you in the cell cycle earlier. And when cell division takes place, half of the DNA goes to one cell and half the DNA goes to the other. So that way that there's an equal sharing of DNA between the two new cells. And we'll go into a lot more detail about that later, guys. So, a quick review of this lesson before I let you guys get to the activities. First off, the surface area to volume ratio prevents cells from getting too big. You can't have Godzilla cells because of this surface area to volume ratio, and the bigger you get, the more energy it takes to move things around. Second, cells follow a cycle that leads to cell division, and that's called the cell cycle. So your key idea here is the cell cycle, so you're going to want to know that. The DNA inside the nucleus is called chromatin, and the structures that hold the DNA are called chromosomes. If there's anything about this chapter you understand, it's this part right here, because this is the fundamental cool stuff of DNA. When they talk about doing crazy things in movies like giving people crazy claws, or like the X-Men who have their crazy powers, it's this part of the cell that's being changed, and they're always talking about chromosomes and chromatin. So if you understand this stuff, you can do some pretty crazy things. And that's it for this lesson, guys. Go ahead and get to work on the activities I have planned, and thank you for watching.